The merry monarch was indeed very merry. Known for his love of partying and women, Charles II brought fun back to England in a big way. Even before his return from exile, however, Charles was already pursuing pleasure in his own way. Primarily through his relationships with women, he acknowledged more than a dozen illegitimate children with several mistresses, though he had many other affairs that produced no children. Unlike many monarchs, Charles maintained multiple mistresses at once, rather than having a single official mistress at court. Unsurprisingly, given the king's larger-than-life personality, the women who captured his heart were formidable characters in their own right, and since most of them were in service to the king at the same time, there was plenty of opportunity for conflict. Charles's relationships with women range from fleeting one-night affairs to longer liaisons, with some kept as minor mistresses and installed at court as part of his informal harem. He fathered several illegitimate children during his exile in France, but although he was often generous to the women involved, he did not grant them positions at court after his accession, Barbara Palmer being the notable exception. As king, he continued to pursue numerous casual liaisons, including several affairs with his wife's ladies-in-waiting. However, he also kept his long-term mistresses in luxury, providing them with money, housing, and sometimes a position at court. He was equally generous toward his children, bestowing numerous titles on those he acknowledged as his own. Barbara Palmer was among the most notorious of King Charles's mistresses, and for many years the most influential. Their liaison endured for roughly 15 years, and produced 5 acknowledged children. A 6th child, however, was not recognised by the king. Born Barbara Villiers into a royalist family of some standing, she married Roger Palmer in 1659, only a year before her fortunes became entwined with those of the exiled Stuart court. She met Charles in 1660 during his exile on the continent, during which time she became his mistress and fell quickly pregnant. She gave birth to Lady Anne Palmer the following February, shortly after Charles had been restored to the English throne. Although Barbara remained legally married, she and Roger Palmer effectively separated in 1662. Despite this estrangement, Palmer continued to profit from his wife's relationship with the king. Charles elevated him to the Irish peerage as Earl of Castlemaine, a title he accepted reluctantly, but from which he nonetheless benefited. At the same time, Charles was engaged in delicate negotiations for a dynastic marriage. He agreed to wed the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza, whose substantial dowry and political alliances were of great value to the English crown. The marriage took place in 1662, when Barbara was heavily pregnant with her second child by the king, her first son. So absorbed was Charles in his attachment to Barbara that he delayed formally meeting his new queen upon her arrival in England. Shortly after the wedding, he arranged for Barbara to be appointed a Lady of the Bedchamber, an action that greatly antagonised Catherine and sparked the first serious conflict within their marriage. The Queen refused to accept Barbara's presence, while Charles refused to back down. The king isolated his wife and dismissed much of her Portuguese retinue, leaving her friendless until she accepted Barbara into her court, something she eventually did, albeit reluctantly. Barbara was widely unpopular at court due to behaviour considered scandalous even for a royal mistress. She entertained numerous lovers, dressed extravagantly, and was notoriously bad-tempered. She frequently flew into rages when the king was unwilling to grant her a particular favour. On one occasion, when Charles refused to acknowledge one of her children as his own, she threatened to kill her children. In another instance, she threatened to smash the newborn baby on the floor in front of him if he did not acquiesce, which he immediately did so. Her influence depended largely on how many other mistresses Charles was involved with at any given time, though her political power remained considerable until her eventual dismissal. In her later years, her behaviour became increasingly erratic and licentious. She conducted numerous indiscreet affairs, much to the king's bemusement, while attempting to pass off her lover's children as his own. After the Great Fire of London, she visited St Paul's Cathedral, where the mummified body of a bishop had been placed on display, while the catacombs were undergoing repairs, claiming she wished to be alone with the corpse to pray. She instead committed a shocking act of desecration. By 1673, wearied by her antics and dramatic behaviour, Charles ordered her to leave court. His decision was aided by the Test Act of that same year, which barred Catholics from holding positions at court, Barbara having converted to Catholicism a decade earlier. She left for the continent, where she engaged in a string of unsuccessful romances as her partners drained her of whatever fortune she had and left her destitute. When her husband died, she remarried, but again her choice was ill-advised and she had him later prosecuted for bigamy and cruelty. She died in 1709 at the age of 68. Frances Stuart was perhaps the only woman associated with Charles II who managed to enjoy the advantages of royal favour without engaging in a physical relationship with the king. In 1662, she was sent to the English court by the king's sister, who believed she would be a fitting addition to the queen's household. Charles reportedly fell in love with her at first sight, even though she was only 14. Frances quickly became a universal favourite at court, including with the queen. Despite the rumours of an affair between her and the king, Frances encouraged the relationship in every way, except the most physical. She spent time with Charles engaging in his favourite pursuits. She was generally good-natured, and of course very beautiful, but without political agenda. A stark contrast to the tempestuousness of Barbara Palmer, who was for the first time threatened as the recognised royal mistress. In 1663, the Queen fell gravely ill and was left fighting for her life. Although Charles remained by her side and comforted her throughout, rumours circulated that he would marry Frances if he were to be widowed. After the Queen recovered, it was speculated that Charles might divorce her in favour of Frances. This, however, was probably unlikely, given how staunchly Charles defended his marriage. Despite his numerous infidelities, Charles continued to court Frances for several years, even going so far as to have her pose as Britannia for the new English coinage in 1664. Despite offers of lands and titles, and clear demonstrations of the king's affection, if nothing else, evident in the length of his pursuit, Frances maintained her virtue. In 1667 she eloped against the king's wishes with another Charles Stuart, the Duke of Richmond and Lennox. Infuriated, Charles declared that he would never see her again, but his anger was short-lived. 2 years later, Frances fell gravely ill with smallpox, prompting the king to come to her bedside, where he forgave her entirely. After her recovery, he allowed her to return to court. By this time, other women had become prominent there, and there was no longer any suggestion of romantic attachment. Instead, Charles provided generously for both Frances and her husband, and he later ensured that she was well supported after her husband's death. Mary Moll Davis became Charles's mistress around 1667, after he had seen her perform on stage. A popular actress and comedienne, she quickly secured the king's favour despite her obscure origins. She was not the most discreet of mistresses, openly flaunting the king's gifts in the presence of his other favourites. In addition to a house, Charles lavished her with jewellery and presented her with a fine coach, which he deliberately paraded past the homes of Barbara Palmer and Nell Gwynn. While Barbara railed against her, Nell took matters into her own hands. When complaints to Charles about Moll's behaviour proved ineffective, Nell invited her rival to dinner, knowing that the king had arranged to visit Moll later that evening. During the meal, Nell slipped a laxative into Moll's food, forcing her to disappoint the king when he arrived. Although Moll later gave birth to Charles's daughter, Lady Mary Tudor, she did not retain his affections for long in his characteristically generous fashion. When he eventually dismissed her, Charles granted her a substantial pension. Eleanor Nell Gwynn is perhaps the best known of Charles's mistresses, largely because of her remarkable rise from humble beginnings, born into an obscure, low-born London background. Nell began her theatrical career selling oranges in the theatre stands. By this time, she was already involved in relationships with members of the theatre world, and was known to have had an affair with the actor Charles Hart, one of the most famous performers of the day. Nell gradually made her way onto the stage, where she gained attention for her lively comedic performances. She would have encountered the king on occasion, and later joined the king's company, which performed privately for the court while the city was gripped by the Great Plague. Her relationship with the king did not begin smoothly. She was initially dismissed before her court career could even begin, as she was thought to have demanded too much money. Nevertheless, Charles was clearly taken with her, and in April 1668 they began a relationship. Although Nell rarely asked for material favours, she was quietly resentful that the king merely rented her a house, while he had purchased homes outright for his other mistresses. Despite Charles's generosity, Nell did not earn enough from the relationship to give up the stage, though after bearing him 2 sons she eventually retired from acting. Nell was popular at court for her bawdy wit. She offered Charles an escape from the stiffness and sophistication of court life, and was well known for her sharp tongue, which she frequently directed at her chief rival for the king's attention, Louise de Keroualle. Famously, when her carriage was surrounded by an angry crowd who mistook her for the French Louise, Nell called out, "Pray, good people, be civil, I am the Protestant whore." Much to their amusement and cheers, Nell remained devoted to Charles, despite offers from elsewhere, and in return he showed her genuine affection. With his dying words, he's said to have commended her to his brother, "Let not poor Nellie starve." She survived Charles by only 2 years, dying of a stroke in 1687, although it was long suspected that Louise had been placed in Charles's bed by the French king. There is no evidence that she acted under anyone's direction but her own. Louise had previously served in the household of Charles's sister, the Duchess of Orleans, and was left without a position after the Duchess's sudden death. Charles invited her to England to serve as a lady-in-waiting to his wife. She arrived in 1670 and almost immediately became the king's mistress, replacing Barbara Palmer as the royal mistress. Once her position was secure, the French king began sending her gifts and quietly funding her lifestyle, so long as she continued to represent French interests at court. Between this support and the revenues provided by her royal lover, Louise became an extremely wealthy woman, and in 1673 she was created Duchess of Portsmouth. She was, however, widely disliked in England because of her French loyalties and her Catholic faith. She found an unlikely ally in Queen Catherine, largely because of the respect she consistently showed her. When the Test Act forced the removal of Catherine's Catholic ladies, the Queen herself intervened to protect Louise's position. She had one child by the king early in their relationship in 1672, a son, though after this she became less sexually available to Charles, probably due to syphilis which she contracted through their relationship. Despite their lack of physical intimacy, she maintained Charles's affections to the end of his life. In their early relationship she was tempestuous and frequently resorted to tearful outbursts to maintain his affection, but recognised the point at which it became necessary to mellow and instead became a loving companion to him. On his deathbed she arranged for his conversion to Catholicism, and the king commanded his brother to ensure she was looked after, along with the Queen and Nell Gwynn. Hortense Mancini, Duchess Mazarin, was not only a mistress of Charles but also came close to becoming his wife. In 1659, just months before the Restoration, Charles proposed marriage to her. Her uncle, Cardinal Mazarin, however, rejected the offer, believing that Charles was no closer to reclaiming his throne than he had been at the beginning of his exile, when Charles was restored to the throne shortly afterwards. Mazarin hastily attempted to reopen negotiations for the match. Despite the considerable financial incentives now offered, Charles refused, and instead went on to marry Catherine of Braganza. Instead, Hortense was married to Armand Charles, but the union proved deeply unhappy. His persistent mistreatment of her, possibly stemming from mental instability, left Hortense isolated from her friends and strictly barred from male company. After he discovered that she was engaged in a relationship with another woman, he had her confined to a nunnery. In 1668 she managed to escape and fled to Italy. There are a number of influential men across the continent offered their support, providing her with houses and financing the lifestyle and salon she established. In 1675, Hortense travelled to England, ostensibly to visit her cousin, Charles's sister-in-law. By the following year, she had become the king's royal mistress, briefly supplanting Louise de Querouaille. Hortense took several lovers during her time at court, including a notably public affair with Charles's daughter, Anne Palmer, Countess of Sussex. The Countess's husband was far less tolerant of the situation and promptly removed his wife from court, when Hortense later began affairs with visiting dignitaries, including the Prince of Monaco. Charles's patience was strained too far, and the resulting quarrel saw her dismissed from his bed and swiftly replaced with Louise. They remained friends on good terms, however, even though Hortense lost her pension and other gifts from the king. She remained in England for the rest of her life, re-establishing her salon in her home in Chelsea where she lived until her death.